The first snow of the year came early that autumn, dry and wind-scattered, stinging the eyes like ash. It clung to the porch rail of Thomas Beckett's homestead like a warning. He stood in the doorway, oil lantern swaying in his hand, and watched the sky bruise itself into a darker gray. Somewhere to the west, a wolf called. Behind him, the hearth gave a tired crackle and hissed low, and the silence in the house settled back in. He'd been a widower for 16 months. Emma had died during childbirth, and the boy had followed her in death by dawn. No cries, no breath, just blood and that still, unnatural silence broken only by Thomas's own panic. The way he had screamed for her, begged for her to open her eyes, gripping her hand like it could anchor her soul. It hadn't. After the burial, folks stopped coming by. Sympathy dried like spit on stone. He'd aged 5 years in one. Some men drank, he worked, cutting fence, wrangling the small herd, hammering nails with a precision that bordered on violent. The house stood firm now, cleaner than ever, but cold, as if even the wood had started to forget what warmth felt like. That morning, before the snow came, he'd been out back splitting mesquite when he saw the buzzards circling. He followed their orbit up into the foothills, expecting maybe a dead cow or some settler's broken horse. What he found instead stopped him still. She was lying face down in the shade of a dead piñon, one arm tucked under her belly, the other reaching as if she'd crawled the last few feet. Her hair was thick with dust and pine needles. Blood had dried black down her calves. She was small, young, couldn't be more than 16, and unmistakably Apache. Thomas stood over her a long time, heart thudding in slow, unsure beats. He fought in the Apache campaigns 10 years back in the Whetstone Mountains. He'd seen boys with their legs burned off, women dragging themselves through cactus just to claw at soldiers. He'd come home from that with a scar across his ribs and a mind full of rot. He'd never spoken about it to Emma, never planned to speak of it again. But now here she was, curled like a dying dog in his hills, her skin blue at the lips and her breath rattling soft and shallow. He could have turned back. Instead, he knelt beside her and rolled her onto her back. Her eyes fluttered once, black as coal. There was no recognition in them, only fear. He took off his coat, bundled it around her, and lifted her into his arms. She didn't speak for the first 3 days. He laid her in Emma's old bed and changed the linens afterward. When he fed her broth, she drank it in bird sips, never taking her eyes off him. When he brought her water, she turned her head to watch the door as if expecting someone or something to come through it. Thomas didn't ask questions. He was a man of few words, and she'd come with silence, so he let her keep it. She was pregnant, that much was clear. He could tell by the way she moved, the hand she kept pressed against her belly even in sleep. He'd known Emma's posture well. The girl was further along, maybe 6 or 7 months. Her body was thin, all ribs and taut skin, the baby making a hard curve beneath her dress. Her feet were cut, one of them badly infected. He spent long hours boiling water, grinding herbs, wrapping the wounds. He didn't touch her without warning, and she didn't flinch when he came near, not after the second day at least. On the 4th day, he found her sitting by the window, watching the woods with a look that chilled him. Not fear exactly, something sharper, something colder. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him without blinking. Her voice, when it came, was low, rasped. "Tansa." He nodded. "I'm Thomas. You're safe here." She didn't reply. By the end of the 2nd week, she could walk again, though she favored her left foot. The infection had lessened. She started tending to small chores, sweeping the hearth, folding linens, stacking wood in the box. He tried to stop her once, but she looked at him like that was the wrong kind of kindness. One night he came in from feeding the stock and found her cleaning his rifle. He watched her, rain soaking his hat, dripping off the brim. She handled the parts carefully, with a practiced ease that made something cold shift behind his ribs. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. She shrugged. "My father." That was all. It wasn't until the 3rd week that he saw the rider. A single man, maybe a mile off, trailing slow along the ridge. Long coat, dark hat, moving with the cautious ease of someone who wanted to be seen, but not caught. Thomas watched him from the barn with his spyglass, breath fogging the lens. The rider paused near the edge of the ridge, turned his horse, and vanished west. Thomas didn't mention it to Tansa, not yet. But that night he pulled the shotgun out from under the bed and checked the shells. He locked the doors, though no one ever locked doors this far north. And when he lay down to sleep, he kept his boots on. By the time snow fully settled, Tansa had warmed slightly. She started humming when she worked, little fragments of songs he didn't recognize. Sometimes she spoke to the baby in Apache, her voice like wind sliding through canyon walls, soft, eerie, beautiful. Thomas didn't ask what she said. He began building a cradle out of mesquite, carved it with the same hands that had dug 2 graves, worked until his knuckles cracked and the skin peeled back. Something about the act settled him, gave his days shape again. But in the back of his mind, the image of the rider lingered. And in the morning, when he checked the path to town, he found the clear mark of hoofprints. 3 sets, heading straight for him. Thomas tracked the hoofprints down the slope behind his property, where the old pinyon roots split the earth like veins. The snow had softened but not covered them, 3 horses, heavy-set, moving slow, not lost, not hunting game. The weight and drag of the hooves told him enough. These were lawmen, or worse, men who wore badges only when it suited them. He returned to the house before dawn fully broke, the cold biting deep through his coat. Tansa was already up, crouched beside the stove, feeding kindling into the flames. Her eyes flicked up when he stepped inside. She didn't ask what he'd seen. She didn't have to. "We have to talk," he said. She straightened, one hand resting on the small of her back. Her breath rose in a cloud. "I saw them," he said. 3 men about 2 miles out. They're looking for someone." She nodded once, like a clock ticking. "They're after me," she said. Thomas waited. They came through Winslow a week ago. One had a silver tooth, another wore a necklace of ears. Her tone didn't waver. "They're not law, not really. They ride for a marshal out of Santa Fe, but they answer to whoever's paying." "Why?" Tansa looked out the window, where the forest rose thick and black beyond the frost. Her voice came quiet. "I killed a man. I didn't have a choice." Thomas didn't speak for a long time. The stove crackled. The wind outside had gone still. "You carrying his child?" he asked. She turned her face back to him. No. He believed her. By midday, the wind shifted east. Thomas saddled the mule, loaded it with provisions, and took the high trail to a ridge that gave view of the southern approach. Through the spyglass, he saw them clearer now, 3 riders, slow as vultures. One had a scarred face, another wore a Union cavalry coat, too fine for the wild. The third, broad-shouldered, pale-eyed, riding a blood bay, wore a revolver low and walked his horse like a preacher pacing a pulpit. They'd set up camp a mile off, not moving fast, not moving dumb. That meant they knew she was close. They were watching, waiting, not sure yet if they'd been seen. He rode back harder than he should have. Found Tanser outside, hanging laundry with her hair tied back in a red ribbon he hadn't seen before. She turned as he approached, her expression unreadable. "We need to prepare," he said. She nodded, "Then teach me what you know." He hesitated. "You already know more than most." "I don't know your land," she said. That much was true. So he did. He showed her the blind gullies near the northern tree line where you could watch for hours unseen. He taught her where the snow stayed softest and where the bluff rock broke the wind best for a rifleman. She listened like someone who didn't expect to live long, but meant to take someone with her. That night, Thomas dug up the tin box he'd buried under the floorboards during the first frost after Emma died. Inside were 2.36 Navy revolvers wrapped in wax cloth, a relic from his Ranger days. He laid them on the table and cleaned them beside the lamplight, wordless. Tansa sat across from him, peeling apples with a small hunting knife, each curl of skin falling neat and slow. Her eyes didn't leave the blade. "You ever been shot?" she asked. He didn't look up, twice. "I got grazed back in Fort Wingate. They didn't know I'd jumped the train." "You travel alone." She nodded. "How'd you survive this far?" Her hand stopped peeling. "I remembered what my mother taught me, and I stopped asking anyone to save me." The next morning, Thomas set traps near the East Ravine. They weren't made to catch men, but he sharpened the stakes beneath them anyway. On the porch, he hammered nails into the boards, angled just enough to catch a boot heel. He kept the shotgun close now, its steel cold in his hand like an old truth. Tansa moved differently, slower but more precise. She no longer flinched at every sound. She kept a revolver tucked in her waistband, the grip worn but cared for. Her stomach had grown round and high, but she moved with a strange calm, as if the weight made her steadier. Thomas didn't ask what her plan was. He saw it in her every movement. She would not run again, and neither now would he. On the fourth night, they heard the whistle. Low, distant, almost kind. A broken melody, one note held too long. Tansa froze where she stood by the door. "That's him," she said. "Which one?" "The one who talks too soft. He likes to whistle when they close in, says it makes the dying less lonely." Thomas closed the shutters. "Not tonight." They sat in silence, guns on the table, waiting. The whistle came again, closer. And then silence. At dawn, Thomas found one of the traps sprung, blood in the snow. A few drops, not much. Someone had stepped wrong and gotten out. They were probing. Not ready to strike, but almost. 2 days passed with no movement, no new prints, no fresh signs. But the dread grew heavier, like storm clouds piling without wind. Tansa didn't sleep. She paced the house in the dark hours, one hand over her belly, whispering in Apache. Thomas heard words he didn't know, but the rhythm had the cadence of morning. He tried to make coffee once, but his hands shook. "You think we'll make it?" he asked. Tansa didn't answer for a long while. "We'll make them bleed," she said. "Then we'll see." They came on the fifth night. Not all at once, not loud, like wolves testing windows, circling. The whistle came again, then a knock. Then silence. Then the first shot. The first shot punched through the window glass like a thrown rock, spraying splinters into the cabin's hearth glow. Thomas dropped where he stood, dragging Tansa with him behind the stone chimney. Smoke from the fire swirled above them, thick and disorienting. Her breath came quick, one hand gripping the revolver, the other pressed against her belly. "Where?" she whispered. "West wall," Thomas said. "Single shooter, high ground." Another shot cracked, louder, and a floorboard split near the table. Tansa crawled low across the planks and retrieved the second revolver, teeth clenched against a grunt of pain. She moved like a fighter, but he saw it, how the weight of the child slowed her, how every second now pulled her closer to the edge of endurance. Thomas raised the shotgun, counted 3, and fired through the window without aiming. The report shook the walls. Somewhere outside, a man cursed. "South side," she said, peering through a gap in the shutter. "I see 2 shadows moving left." He nodded. "I'll take the front. When I move, shoot low and right." She didn't ask if he'd be back. The front door flung open with a groan and slammed against the frame behind him. Thomas stepped into the snow, crouched, and sprinted toward the barn. His boots crunched loud. Deliberately, he wanted to draw them. A bullet hissed past his head, caught the edge of the post behind him. He dove and rolled, landed hard, and scrambled under the old hay trough. The wood stank of mold and animal piss, but it gave him cover. Another shot rang out, closer now. Then a scream. Not loud, cut short. He froze. It was Tansa. Of it. Back in the cabin, she had waited exactly 10 seconds before moving, just long enough to make them think she'd hesitated. Then she fired through the wall. The first man hadn't expected that. He'd crept too close, thinking she was still holed up behind the chimney. The bullet struck his thigh, shattered bone. She heard the crack of it and his breath catch. He fell, rifle slipping from his hand into the snow. She didn't wait, kicked open the back door and limped out behind the shed, flanking low, fast, as best she could. He was crawling toward a horse hitched at the tree line. Blood smeared behind him like ink on parchment. She stepped into view, revolver raised. He looked up, blue coat, yellow teeth. "You don't have to," he started. She fired once, just above the heart. This time, no one screamed. Of it. Thomas circled wide. The man he'd drawn out had taken shelter behind a boulder down the slope. He moved too much, nervous, uncertain, not a soldier. A hunter, maybe, or a hired killer. Thomas fired both barrels from 30 feet. The buckshot tore through the air, and the man toppled backwards, his chest a mangled mess. He didn't get up. When Thomas reached him, he was still twitching. A piece of metal gleamed at his belt, silver, carved with the letters CT, not a badge, just a name. He turned and ran back uphill. Of it. She was in the snow, kneeling, cradling her stomach. Thomas dropped beside her. "He's gone," she said. Her face was pale, lips cracked. "But I think it's time." "What?" "The baby." Thomas looked around. The air was still. Smoke drifted from the cabin. No more gunshots, no movement in the trees. He scooped her up and carried her inside. Of it. The birth lasted through the night. She didn't scream. She gritted her teeth and gripped the bedpost hard enough to splinter it. Thomas had only seen one labor before Emma's, but this wasn't the same. Tansa fought it like a siege. Gave nothing she didn't have to. She bled, a lot, but she didn't break. By dawn, the child came, a girl, slick with blood, tiny and fierce in her cries. Tansa didn't look at the baby right away. She stared at the ceiling, sweat beading her temples, eyes unfocused. "She's alive," Thomas said, voice hoarse. Slowly, Tansa turned her head. The baby blinked up at her, fists clenched, lungs strong. She reached out and took her into her arms. The cabin fell quiet. Of it. They buried the second man behind the ridge. They didn't find the third. Tracks led west, faint, deliberate. He'd seen the fight and vanished, not a coward, a strategist. Thomas knew what that meant. He'd be back. But for now, the cabin stood quiet again. Tansa named the child Kalia. She said it meant coyote born in snow. And Thomas began to build a second cradle, not for another child, but for the rifles. Winter thickened like grief. By the time the trees iced over and the mule began to limp from cold in its hooves, the baby had learned to clutch fingers and quiet herself at the sound of Tansa's voice. The girl didn't cry often. She watched, unblinking, even in her sleep, as if she understood more than she ought to. Thomas fixed the barn roof and kept a loaded rifle above the doorframe. He'd seen signs in the woods, cuts on trees that weren't natural, a circle of stones still warm from a buried fire, faint footprints that didn't belong to him or Tansa. Not many, but fresh. The third man was still out there. He knew now the kind of patience a hunter needed. Not the short burn of anger, but the long hunger of a man who watched rivers freeze and thaw and never stopped moving. And he was watching them. Tansa had healed quickly, but the labor had stripped something from her. Not her strength, she had that still, but her stillness. She began walking the property each morning, even with snow waist deep. With the baby strapped to her chest, she circled the barn, the hill crest, the southern tree line. Every step marked territory, claimed it back. "She's too young to be out there," Thomas said once, when the baby coughed in the cold. "She was born in it," Tansa answered. He didn't argue again. They spoke little, but the silence between them changed. He'd begun leaving an extra portion on her plate. She began placing his coffee by the window before sunrise. He repaired her boots without asking. She mended the hole in his coat's shoulder seam. One night by the fire, the baby asleep in a basket between them, Tansa looked up and said, "What was her name?" Thomas didn't pretend not to know who she meant. Lemma. What kind of woman was she? He thought for a long while. The fire popped and hissed. She didn't give up on people. Tansa nodded. Is that why you buried your guns? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In late January, the mule went missing. At first, Thomas thought it had broken loose during the night storm, but when he followed the prints down the gully, he saw the drag marks. The animal had been taken, likely at night. No blood, no fight, just gone. He returned before dusk and told Tansa. She didn't speak, just set the baby on her blanket and pulled the rifle from above the door. That night she slept sitting up, back against the wall, baby in one arm, gun in the other. Thomas did the same, watching the window, shotgun across his knees. They didn't speak of fear. It had settled too deep. 3 days later, he found the mule's jawbone nailed to a tree. The rest of the skull was missing. It was meant as a message, but it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a ritual. By February, they began to prepare like it was war. Thomas rigged bells from scrap tin along the trees. He reset the traps, sharper now, with teeth. Tansa carved small stakes for close-quarter fighting and showed him how to tie them into bundles on the belt. She still wore the revolver, but her blade work was faster. They moved together now, not like two people caught in coincidence, but like a unit trained to kill. Tansa took to whispering old prayers over the baby's cradle, not Christian, older, Apache songs, some laced with grief, others with vengeance. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the sound. It was the same tone soldiers made when they loaded their rifles at dawn, knowing they wouldn't all see dusk. Kalia never cried when she heard it. She just watched. They found the first trap snapped one morning with blood frozen into the snow. Whatever it had caught, it hadn't died right away. Thomas followed the trail a quarter-mile before it vanished, but the mark it left, a torn piece of cloth, black with ash and grease, was proof. He was close now, closer than ever before. Tansa began carrying the child in a sling, even while cleaning fish or chopping kindling. She said she didn't want to leave her alone, not even for breath. Thomas didn't question it. He'd seen what men could do to women, and what men like this did to children. It happened 5 nights later. The wind howled too early. The fire refused to catch, like the wood had gone wet with bad luck. Kalia cried once, short, piercing, and then went still. Thomas opened the door to check the traps. The wind smelled wrong, like rust. He turned back, but it was already too late. The man was inside. A ghost through the rear window, silent as smoke. Tansa had moved too fast, but not fast enough. The man struck her with the butt of a pistol, sent her sprawling across the table. Blood spilled from her temple. Thomas raised the shotgun. The man laughed. He was tall, gaunt, not pale now, but burned from sun and wind. His right hand was wrapped in leather, fingers gone. His eyes gleamed silver in the firelight. "You're the one that took her in," he said. Thomas didn't reply. "She slit my brother's throat while he slept, left him choking in his own spit. That what you teach, out here. She did what she had to." "You'll do the same now," the man said. Then he drew. But Thomas didn't fire the shotgun. Tansa did. She'd rolled off the table, gun in hand, and shot once, straight into the man's throat. He stumbled back, choking. Blood sprayed the hearth. The pistol dropped from his hand. Then he fell. Hard, final. The silence after was longer than any they'd known. Thomas stood still, the shotgun slack in his grip. Tansa breathed heavy, face bleeding, eyes burning. The baby didn't cry. Tansa dropped the gun, slid down the wall, and looked at Thomas. "He was the last one," she said. Thomas nodded. She let out a breath that wasn't relief, just emptiness. "I'm tired," she said. He walked over, knelt beside her, and touched her hand. "You're safe now." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Safety was a story people told themselves between storms. Spring came with a bitter thaw. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, leaving behind patches of bare, ugly ground where things had once died, hoofprints frozen in the clay, bloodstains washed pale by rain, the bones of birds caught in traps meant for men. Thomas dug a grave behind the barn, not near Emma. That place was sacred. He buried the third man beneath a cedar tree, no marker. Tansa watched from the ridge with the baby in her arms, face unreadable. When he finished, he burned the man's coat, his belt, even the pistol. Let the ashes rise into the sky like they didn't belong to anything human. Neither of them spoke for hours after. They began to clean in earnest, not just the cabin but the land. Thomas cut back the dead branches, dug a trench to redirect runoff, cleared out the old snares. Tansa tore out the curtains and stitched new ones from burlap feed sacks. She bundled the baby to her chest and worked with one hand, braiding twine with the other, humming softly. They didn't talk about leaving. They didn't talk about staying. They just stayed. Each day held a weightless kind of decision. Each evening, Thomas would check the horizon for riders, but there were none. They were alone now, just the three of them, which was more than nothing. One morning, Kalia took her first steps. In the front room, chasing a piece of string Tansa had tied to a stick, she didn't fall, she didn't cry. Just toddled forward, determined, dark eyes fixed on the string like it was a star. Thomas watched from the doorway, hand braced against the frame. Something caught in his throat. Not joy, not quite. Just the knowledge that life still moved forward, whether you wanted it to or not. Tansa looked at him and smiled, small, tired. "She's strong," she said. "She's yours," he answered. That was enough. Later that week, Tansa took the baby down to the creek. She stripped her of the thick winter layers and let her touch the water. It was still cold, but not cruel. The current slid between the child's fingers like silk. Tansa knelt in the shallows, lifted a handful of water, and whispered an old name into it before letting it go. Thomas watched from a distance. He didn't ask what the ritual meant. Some things were meant to be kept in the mother tongue. When she stood and walked back toward him, Kalia asleep against her chest, her face held a quietness he hadn't seen before. Not peace, but something close to forgiveness. Not for others, for herself. They planted in the spring. Beans, squash, tomatoes. The soil was rocky, but Tansa showed him how to break it with ash and bone meal. The child sat in the shade of an old feed barrel, hands full of dirt, eyes full of sky. They didn't expect much from the crop, but still they planted. Still they hoped. One evening, thunder rolled far off in the distance. Dry lightning spidered across the western ridge, but no rain followed. The air was thick with memory. Tansa stood on the porch, watching the storm with Kalia asleep in her arms. Thomas stepped out beside her. "They won't come again," he said. She nodded slowly. "No," she said, "but others will, someday." He looked at her. "You gonna run?" She turned to face him fully, moonlight on her cheek, the scar at her temple pale but permanent. "No," she said, "not anymore." He reached for Kalia, and she let him take her. The baby stirred, opened her eyes, and stared at the sky, unafraid. The next morning, Thomas rode into town for the first time in 6 months. He didn't say much to anyone, bought salt, oats, a spool of thread, refilled the cartridges. At the general store, the clerk eyed him warily. "Didn't think you were still up on that ridge," the man said. "I'm there," Thomas said, "not alone." The clerk nodded but didn't press. Before he left, Thomas pinned a sheet to the town board. No name, just a sentence burned into the wood with a hot nail. "This land is watched. This house is not empty." Then he rode back before dusk. In the summer, the beans grew tall. The baby spoke her first word, not mama, not papa, but something like son. Tansa smiled when she said it. She whispered a story about her grandmother, who used to say the son remembered all things, even those buried deep. Thomas sat on the steps, rifle across his lap, and watched them, not guarding, just watching. The sky above was cloudless. The land, for once, was still. And though they had come to this place broken, hunted, unwanted, they stayed. Not because it was safe, but because it was theirs.